We're very happy to have you here with us. We have decided to have this interview because of the two books you have edited and authored in, I think, 2007 and 2008, if I'm not incorrect. The first one was African Perspectives on China and Africa, and the second one was about China's new role in Africa and the South, and you were looking for a new perspective. And you have also founded Fahamu, which, if I'm pronouncing this correctly, is a network of social justice, and you have written and edited for Pamba Suka Press. Yeah, and we are very interested in talking with you about China's role in Africa, how it's often said. So you have been very active in many fields, including Sino-African relations. Why did you become interested in this topic?
Well, I think originally we were very concerned by the fact that the mainstream media presented China as the new dragon coming in to eat up everything in Africa. And the reality is what that did was to draw attention away from the fact that the UK, US, Europe, including Germany, has massive investments in Africa and actually exploits the resources and the people of Africa to a far greater degree than China has been able to. This is not to say that China, and particularly the multinational corporations in China, have no interest in profiting from Africa. Of course they do, but they come late to the party, and so they can only dance with those who are left over. And so if you look, for example, people talk about China's role in oil, but in reality, even in Nigeria, they have less than 5% of greenfield sites. If you look across the continent, the two places where China has actually got involved in oil, extraction of oil, has been one is Sudan, where the Americans pulled out and the American government actually prohibited the US companies from exploiting oil, and the other is in Angola. And again, there the situation was that the Angolan government was negotiating with the IMF and the World Bank, and they would not support the development of an infrastructure in China for that, in Angola for that. Yeah. And so the Chinese offered to help. So I think what we were trying to do is to say, look, we have to get a balance. We have to actually see China for what it is. It's not to be romantic about it. Secondly, we were concerned that African perspectives were not being heard.
Yeah.
And again, it was the viewpoint of the Western media, which has a vested interest in hiding the fact that the West exploits and has exploited and colonizes, and indeed militarily has a huge presence in Africa, which China does not.
Yeah. So can you tell us a bit more of what you think? How is China related to social justice in Africa? Because you have been an activist for social justice for the continent for quite some time.
Well, we were concerned, and that people talk about the Chinese in Africa, but nobody talks about the Americans in Africa, or the British in Africa, or the Germans in Africa. Why not? People talk about companies in Africa. They talk about Exxon and Mobil and Shell, but they don't talk about the Dutch or the Americans. Why not? There is a certain racism about the Chinese, okay?
Yeah.
The reality is that there are Chinese companies, multinationals, which are operating in Africa, like any other multinational. And I think we have to accept that. Now, clearly, they are also involved, as in Zambia, in the exploitation of labor. And our interest is to make sure that irrespective of who these multinationals might be, people need to be able to determine their own lives and to be able to negotiate for justice in the workplace and in their social conditions. But we were also interested to say, what about building solidarity links between activists and social movements in Africa with their counterparts in China? And the second book that we published actually had an origin in a meeting in Hong Kong where we had connections with Chinese civil society. And so we were looking to, and we built up a program of building connections between journalists in both continents, between academics in both continents, but also looking at how do we connect with, for example, environmental movements in China. And I think that was the intention. We wanted to have a relationship with working people and movements in China, as well as within Africa itself. So we didn't want to leave it just to the state to negotiate the deals.
Yeah. So I think you've already talked quite a bit about your motives in publishing China's new role in Africa in 2008, I think, and African perspective on China and Africa the year before that. But could you add anything else that was particularly important when you edited those two books?
We were surprised at how little there was available from African perspectives and about the relationship between the governments in the global south and with China.
Yeah.
We were trying to understand what was the nature of what was going on. Remember that historically China has had some amazing relationships with Africa. People forget about the Tanzam Railway, for example, which was built as a solidarity action. China never profited from that. But it was a very, very important intervention in the context of South Africa's isolation of the frontline states and the ability of Zambia to be able to access a port, being a landlocked country.
Yeah.
And I think those are really important dimensions. Now, we're not naive. We think that politics have moved on, and there still remains a tension in China between those who hold progressive views, who see ways of developing both China and having solidarity links, and the more neoliberal sections of the Communist Party who have become dominant.
Yeah. So I think the 2007 book was one of the very first to talk about the common African response to some of the challenges the relationship to China posed. And there is still a lot of talk in academia about African agency in dealing with China. So what do you think has changed in this regard in the last 10 years?
I actually think very little has changed. It has been a period during which the US has built, through AFRICOM, well over 54 different military bases on the continent. And China has not built any.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, the mainstream media focuses attention on China and China to cut through the neoliberal crap that the World Bank and IMF insisted on. That is, that no infrastructural development. China said, well, okay, you want a football stadium? Have a football stadium. You want a bridge? Have a bridge. And it's smart on their part because they had no other way of developing a relationship. I think that the commercial relationship, trade relationship with China has expanded over the last 10 years. I think, as far as I can recall, the China is today the largest trader with Africa. And what is not is the number of African companies which have established bases in China and who have regular. So, in other words, China is being exploited by African. I think some people don't realize that that's the case. You get on any flight from any African country to China, and the plane is absolutely full of businessmen. Okay, trading goods.
Yeah.
And so this is how capitalism operates. This is how it does. I think that people have gotten much more used to having China becoming a player in the trade area. But why is so much attention? I mean, if you look at the foreign direct investment by China in Africa, it is 1/10 of that of the UK. Yeah. Why do people not talk about the English invasion of Africa? Why do people not talk about the European invasion of Africa, of the American invasion of Africa? Why that silence? And yet all this attention on China. The other thing I think to be aware of, India is a big seller of arms to Africa. China doesn't sell arms to Africa. In both India and in Europe and in America, there are those who have offshore tax-free, tax avoidance schemes to bank their profits so they don't pay tax. That is not possible in China. So, which is the bigger evil? And I think that there has to be a re-examination of this, and not from the perspective of saying one is better than the other, but to map out a path for self-determination, for people realizing their own humanity, to be able to organize, determine our own destinies. And I think that was the project that we were trying to nurture. And it remains, I think, a key issue that we need to continue with.
Yeah. So African perspective on China and Africa is talking a lot from a civil society perspective, which is also something that I feel has been very neglected in academia so far. How well do you think do African civil societies understand China by now? And what is your view on the other side round? How do Chinese people living in Africa understand the societies they're living and working with?
Well, I don't think that there hasn't been much growth in understanding of China or what is happening in China. I think too many of so-called civil society organizations in Africa are too preoccupied with courting American and European institutions to be able to get funding.
Yeah.
And China, although it has begun to do some of that, it's much more complex to get funding from China for for civil society. They're not into that game. And so I have written about the role of NGOs in Africa taking the missionary position. That is, doing what the missionaries in the past used to do, and so they are preoccupied with being as Western as they can. There isn't a pressure to become Chinese. There are a few organizations which have connections with China and will understand how to try to develop that relationship, but they are a minority. I think that people fall for the propaganda that's put out by the Americans and by Western media, and I think the situation is that very few organizations understand what is happening in China, and to be fair, I don't think there are many Chinese institutions that have a particular understanding of what is happening. But if you look in South Africa, and people blame the China for the collapse of course, huge unemployment in South Africa, as in many other countries. But if you actually look at the facts of the matter, that was a direct result of the neoliberal policies, structural adjustment policies that were the US and World Bank. And so, so something that has undermined African industry, which was caused by structural adjustment programs, is now blamed on the Chinese.
Yeah.
And I said, there is this dialogue amongst NGOs, the Chinese, and it's loaded.
Yeah.
And I think it's very unfortunate that that's the case.
Yeah. So a question I've asked myself when I compiled the resources list that we are about to publish is why do we not see very many African scholars talking on the topic? Do you think that China and Africa is not as interesting to African scholars, or do you think there is any other reason that we are mostly reading Western and Chinese authors?
Well, I think that I'm not sure it's necessarily true that there isn't interest amongst African academics in China. I think what you have to consider this in this context. If you search on the internet, if you search on academic databases, what you find is that Americans quote only American research. They don't quote African research. The Brits do the same. The Europeans do the same. So there is an objective silence or reference to African academia and intellectual work. And worse still, the algorithms that are used by Google and others when you search on the internet are based on the frequency with which particular works are cited or sites which are referred to by people. But of course, that's a self-reinforcing because if Africa is not quoted except by the sort of media, then all you will get is a reinforcement of that. So it adds to the silence. So I don't think it's true. I think I've been amazed at how much work has been done, and certainly in conferences I've been to, I'm constantly amazed at both the quality and the quantity of information in Africa and about China. And so I think it's a false perception, which is reinforced by the way in which referencing and citing and connections on the internet are done.
Yeah, so could you give students like me where do we have to search to find those African voices if we are interested in reading them?
Well, I think what you have to do is to connect with African institutions. I mean, there are many South African institutions which publish stuff on China. There's some really interesting work happening in Tunisia and in Algeria. In West Africa, there are a lot of interesting work being going on. There's work going on in Zambia, and it's a matter of finding the connections and finding the papers and seeing the references. I worked at the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, CODESRIA, which is based in Dakar. And you know, there's a sizable amount of research which they support, which is taking place there. But I think it's within that, because there is so much silence about Africa.
Yeah. So you know the media landscape in Africa very well, and we are seeing a lot of Chinese media being active in pretty much all over Africa, CCTV, for example, also the China Daily or Xinhua. And this has been seen very critical in the West. The West is afraid that we are seeing an undemocratic, unfree media model being exported to Africa. What is your view on that?
Well, look at the dominant media in Africa and internationally. Okay, you have essentially international media owned by a handful, 4 or 5 people. Okay, they're not elected. If you look at CNN, if you look at Fox News, how democratic are they? Where is the basis of their democracy? This claim that they are free media. Corporate media internationally is owned and controlled. It is a means of propaganda, and it is largely a mouthpiece for the international corporations and for the American regimes, including the Trump regime, and to say that China is a despotic, yeah, sure, but nowhere the scale. So again, you have this manifestation of prejudice. That just because China, I have no illusion necessarily have in China, but to say that the media is that their media is any less democratic than the American. Look at the billions of dollars made by these companies, these private corporations that own the media, and you can't get information out unless they agree to it. And I think one of the advantages of having China doing that, people like Al Jazeera in the past were doing that, is to give an alternative perspective on what is happening. Yes, and by providing that alternative perspective, you have at least the alternative. So in other words, it becomes more democratic because it is not all over. So I think I welcome the arrival of various China news services, and because it gives me another perspective. It doesn't mean I believe everything that they say, but I don't believe everything that the Americans say. You know, New York Times, Washington Post. I mean, look at them. They are today, licking the arse of a fascist regime which has taken over the U.S. I mean, how low can you sink? How undemocratic can you be that they laud a what is clearly a fascist enterprise.
So there is a tendency to talk in the West about China and Africa that is very simplistic. We only talk about China as if it was all the same, and it's also sometimes, or even very often, that we still talk about Africa as if it was just one big country. So what do you think is the biggest picture people are missing if they simplify like that? Or do you think that there is actually something you can claim that China does in every African state that is always the same?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important question. I mean, I think that what it does is to ignore the diversity of our different countries. You can make some generalizations, as you can about the generalizations about the role of Western aid and of the role of international companies and so on. So while you can make the general, we have to get down to looking at how it works out on the ground. So I think there's a tendency to again, I think there's a certain racist undertone in that, and saying it's China. We don't talk about whites taking over Africa. We talk about China talking it. The other side of it is that and when we were trying to do research on China's role and investments and operations in Africa, we began to realize that it was really quite difficult to get the data, because even when we went to Beijing and we met with senior officials, many of them couldn't provide the data because it's not centralized. Each province also has interventions independently in Africa. And secondly, there is, people talk about these Chinese companies, but many of these are corporations. When I've argued this, people say to me, well, actually, but the Chinese government has a subsidy. Every single transnational corporation I can think of, which is operating in Africa, is heavily subsidized in terms of tax breaks, in terms of concessions, and even public money being invested into them. Yeah. Most of aid today from the West is invested via private companies. This is a subsidy to transnationals. So there's no difference in that sense. It's just different mechanisms for underwriting the operations. And so to generalize on that basis is based on this sort of racist view of China. Are hotting up now with the Trump regime. People talk a lot about isolation of Russia, etc. I think the real fear I have, and why what's happening in North Korea is also problematic, is that, and if you look at the military bases that have been established around China, this is undertaken by Obama, by the way, and that China is the target. Capitalist system is under huge crisis. And China is so deeply involved in that. Just give you an idea, over 60%, I think it's figured something like 68% of Chinese exports are manufactured by Western transnational corporations based in China. Okay, so when people talk about Chinese goods being sent out, well, what is a Chinese good? Okay, here I am talking to you on a computer, most of which has been made in China. It's not a Chinese computer, it's an Apple computer. It's an American company. It's an American transnational company which uses and exploits Chinese labor to produce this. So which part of this is American? Which part of this is Chinese? Today you cannot talk about national production. It doesn't exist except in very minor little things that are produced. Because we have now today a world which is dominated by transnational corporations, and you know, there are maybe 400-500 corporations which produce and own everything. You look at the clothes you're wearing, the television behind you, the computer that you're using, the pens that you're writing with, things you listen to. All of these are produced by those small number of companies.
Yeah.
And they're transnational companies. They're not Chinese, and they're not just American.
So the discussion on the political dimension of China and Africa has so far mostly focused on fears by the West that China is exporting a Chinese model to Africa, whatever that Chinese model is. But I think what most Western media would say is that we are talking about a strong authoritarian developmental state. What do you think about that? Is there such a thing as a Chinese model, and does it get exported to Africa?
Well, first of all, let's just talk about despotic models. America has been responsible for coups d'etat and assassinations in Africa. Patrice Lumumba in Congo, Thomas Sankara, Amilcar Cabral, and so on and so on and so forth. Okay, the establishment of despotic regimes is an expertise of the Americans. That's what the CIA is there to do. Okay, and so that it's you have to keep that point in mind. But the other thing is, when you talk about exporting China's model, well, I would actually welcome that, because the Chinese model was fundamentally based on a people's revolution, which overthrew capitalism, which established a people's an economy which today was only possible because of that revolution. If you think about it, in 1945, China was the poorest country in the world. It was it had massive famines, massive children were dying before the age of 3. I mean, it was horrendous. And so, if we are going to export the Chinese model, well, then let's have the revolutions, and then we'll talk about what we build out of that. So it's not the Chinese model that's being done. It's the hypocrisy of the Western media, which tries to pretend that there is so-called democracy in America. Well, if you actually look at the origins of liberalism, it was born as a twin to racism. The social differentiation that you see in America, if you look at the exploitation of black people, if you look at the genocide and elimination of the original populations of the Americas, is that the model that they would like? Well, they have exported that. They carried out genocide in Africa. The Herero people. They carried out mass killings in Kenya. They killed thousands just to prevent a liberation movement from determining its own future. Africa's bodies are everywhere. And these have been, I'm not a great fan of the current form of Chinese Chinese economy with its neoliberal approaches, but China has never, to my knowledge, carried out the scale of genocides and enslavement and exploitation that we see carried out by European, American, Japanese companies.
So let's get to the last question, which I'm sure you will have to say a lot about. So Western experts and media are very critical about China's role on the African continent, especially with regards to what they claim is a near exploitation of Africa. Given the history of Western states in Africa and the history of colonialism and neo-colonialism, that appears to be quite hypocritical. So what do you think about that claim?
Well, as I said earlier on, I mean, because China came late to the party, it isn't able to access resources and to exploit in the way that the West has been able to do. Okay, that's not to say that had they come earlier to the party, they might have been dancing with the more attractive partners. But the reality is, it's left with having to deal with whatever it can.
Yeah.
I think they've been very smart in being willing to establish relationship where they say, okay, you want a football stadium, you want a bridge, you want a hospital, we'll build it for you. Okay. A lot of people criticize China for the fact that they bring in Chinese labor to build these things. But if you actually look at the examples of those, what you find is that the African governments are saying we want it done by next year, and we don't have the labor, the skilled labor to do it. Why don't we have the skill? After 50 years of independence, why don't we have the skilled labor? Well, it's because our regimes are too busy making money out of exploiting people and undermining the development of our continent, that they now have to import labor from China in order to achieve these things. Yeah. It's a real condemnation of our governments, their failure to invest, their failure to develop the continent, and to become willing servants, not only of American and European empire, but the emerging Chinese dominance. Well, so and so China is now a major trade player in Africa. And so the American corporations really resent that. They see Africa as theirs. And it's time we Africans saw Africa as ours.
Yeah.
That's what's missing.
Yeah. Well, that is quite a good closing sentence, I think. Thank you very much. This has been really interesting and will be a great contribution to what we want to publish at Mapping China. So thank you a lot.